By the time Jimmy Connors walked into the 1991 U.S. Open, tennis had already tried to put him in the past tense. He was 39 years old. His ranking had fallen. His body had been through surgeries, mileage, and more punishment than most careers could survive. The sport had moved toward bigger athletes, heavier power, and younger faces. Connors was supposed to be a memory. The snarling left-hander from Illinois who had ruled the 1970s, offended the tennis establishment, and turned matches into street fights under stadium lights. Then, in New York, he gave tennis one last problem. Over 2 wild weeks at the U.S. Open, Connors turned a late-career wildcard run into one of the most unforgettable closing acts in the sport's history. He did not win the title. That is what makes the story better. He won something stranger. Control of the entire tournament's emotional center. Younger champions were still in the draw, but the crowd kept leaning toward the old rebel, waiting to see how far stubbornness could carry a man. To understand why that run mattered, you have to go back to the beginning, before the roars, before the lawsuits, before the fist pumps and the boos and the records. You have to see why Connors did not simply play tennis. He attacked the culture around it, and by the end, the question is not just how a 39-year-old reached the U.S. Open semifinals. The question is why American tennis needed someone like Jimmy Connors in the first place. Connors came from Illinois, not from the polished country club image that tennis liked to project in the mid-20th century. He was born in East St. Louis and raised in a family where tennis was not a polite hobby. It was work. His mother, Gloria, and his grandmother, Bertha, were central to his development. Accounts of his childhood often emphasize how intense that environment was. Connors was not shaped to glide through the sport. He was shaped to compete as if every point was personal. That matters because tennis, especially at its highest levels, had long been wrapped in manners. There were rules, but there were also unwritten codes. Keep your temper under control. Respect the hierarchy. Do not make yourself larger than the game. Do not turn the crowd into part of the match. The best players could be fiery, of course, but the public image of tennis still leaned toward restraint. Connors arrived with a different message. He was left-handed, compact, relentless, and early to the ball. His game was built around pressure. He hit the ball flat. He took returns aggressively. His two-handed backhand was not just a reliable shot, it was a weapon. He played close to the baseline and made opponents feel rushed. Instead of waiting for elegance to win the point, he tried to seize time from the other player. That style had consequences. Connors did not give opponents much room to breathe. He did not give crowds much room to relax either. He fed off noise. He argued. He stared. He pumped his fist. He made faces. He could look offended by a line call, by an opponent's shot, or by the idea that anyone in the stadium doubted him. For some fans, he was thrilling. For others, he was too much. That split reaction became part of his identity. Connors was never just watched. He was judged, and he seemed to enjoy making the judgment difficult. In the early 1970s, tennis itself was changing. The Open era had begun only a few years earlier, allowing professionals and amateurs to compete together at major tournaments. Money, television, sponsorship, and player power were reshaping the sport. Old tennis and new tennis were colliding. Connors stepped into that collision as if it had been designed for him. He was young, brash, and unconcerned with asking permission. He turned professional, won quickly, and by 1974, he was not merely a promising American, he was the force of the men's game. That season is still one of the central chapters of his career. Connors won the Australian Open, Wimbledon, and the U.S. Open in the same year. He did not play the French Open, and the circumstances around that absence have been discussed for decades, often tied to his involvement with World Team Tennis and conflicts between tennis authorities and players. What matters for the story is that Connors had a season that could have placed him in the conversation for a calendar Grand Slam, yet politics and power structures around the game became part of the narrative. That was typical of Connors. With him, the tennis was never separated from the argument. At Wimbledon in 1974, he overwhelmed Ken Rosewall in the final. Rosewall was a respected, elegant champion from an earlier era, a master of touch and timing. Connors represented something harsher and younger. The contrast was almost symbolic. One man seemed connected to tennis's old grammar. The other was rewriting the sentence with a fist. At the U.S. Open that year, Connors again beat Rosewall in the final, this time on grass at Forest Hills. The scoreline was one-sided. The message was not. Connors had not eased into the top. He had kicked the door open. But the establishment did not simply embrace him. Connors had friction with officials, with other players, and at times with the broader tennis system. He was independent to the point of isolation. He did not always join player organizations in the way others expected. He took legal action in tennis disputes. He could be seen as defending his rights, or as making everything about himself, depending on who was telling the story. That ambiguity is crucial. Connors was not a simple folk hero. He could be abrasive. He could be exhausting. Some of his behavior aged poorly, especially in an era when fans and commentators looked more closely at sportsmanship. Even during his own time, not everyone admired the way he competed. But whether people liked him or not, they had to react to him, and that reaction helped change American tennis. Connors brought a blue-collar edge to a sport that was still trying to decide how much showmanship it could tolerate. He made tennis feel less like a private ritual and more like public combat. He invited the crowd into his emotional weather. When he was angry, the stadium felt it. When he was wounded, the stadium felt that too. When he began a comeback, even people who disliked him could sense the temperature change. This was not just personality, it was strategy. Connors understood momentum as a physical force. A fist pump after a return winner was not decoration, it was a signal. To the opponent, it said, "I am still here." To the crowd, it said, "Come with me." To himself, it seemed to say, "Keep fighting until the match has no choice but to turn." That mentality made his rivalries sharper. Bjorn Borg was one kind of contrast. Borg was cool, controlled, and almost unreadable. Connors was heat. Their matches carried a clash of temperaments as much as styles. Borg's heavy topspin and patience tested Connors' flat, attacking rhythm. When Borg rose, Connors had to confront a player who could absorb his pressure without appearing disturbed by it. John McEnroe was another contrast, and in some ways a mirror. McEnroe was also left-handed, also American, also willing to argue, also impossible to ignore. But McEnroe's genius came with touch, angles, serve and volley craft, and a kind of improvisational brilliance. Connors was more direct. If McEnroe seemed to bend the geometry of the court, Connors tried to punch through it. Their rivalry had edge because both men wanted the stage. Neither was built to disappear politely while the other performed. When Connors and McEnroe shared a court, the match could feel like a contest for emotional ownership as much as points. Then came Ivan Lendl, a younger opponent who represented the next wave, disciplined, powerful, and physically systematic. Lendl's rise in the 1980s forced Connors into a different role. He was no longer the young disruptor. He became the veteran being hunted, then the veteran refusing to go away. That transition is where Connors becomes more interesting. Many champions are compelling when they dominate. Fewer remain compelling when they stop dominating. Connors did, partly because he kept winning enough to matter, partly because he had built his identity around resistance. Losing did not soften the story. It gave him more to resist. His record is enormous. Connors won 8 major singles titles. He spent years at or near the top of the rankings. He won more tour-level singles titles than any other man in the Open era, according to the standard ATP count. He is also remembered for longevity, for playing hundreds upon hundreds of matches across changing surfaces, generations, and styles. But numbers alone do not explain him. If they did, his 1991 U.S. Open would be a footnote because he did not win the tournament. Instead, it became one of the defining memories of his career. The reason is simple. Connors made defeat feel negotiable. The 1991 U.S. Open began with Connors far outside the circle of favorites. He was not seeded. His ranking had dropped sharply. He was in the draw with younger, stronger players who had grown up in a sport partly shaped by him. The idea that he could contend seriously at 39 sounded romantic at best. But Connors had 2 advantages that do not always show up in scouting reports. First, he knew how to play in New York, not just on the court, but in the emotional architecture of the place. The U.S. Open crowd can be loud, impatient, funny, cruel. loyal, and restless. It does not always reward perfect manners. It rewards nerve. Connors understood that better than almost anyone. Second, he had nothing to protect. A younger contender might fear embarrassment. Connors had already been embarrassed, praised, booed, celebrated, written off, and revived. By 1991, he was playing with the dangerous freedom of someone who had lived through every possible version of public opinion. His first-round match against Patrick McEnroe became the spark. Patrick was the younger brother of John McEnroe, and he was not simply a name in the draw. He was a capable professional, and against Connors, he built what looked like a winning position. Connors fell behind by 2 sets. In the 5th set, he was also down heavily, with the match close to slipping away. For most 39-year-olds, that is where the sentimental story ends. The old champion fights, the crowd applauds, the younger player advances, and everyone agrees it was a nice moment. Connors refused that script. He began clawing back, not with the smooth inevitability of a favorite, but with the rough, grinding urgency that made people lean forward. He chased balls. He barked at himself. He pulled the audience into the match point by point. The comeback became less about tactics and more about belief spreading through the stadium. When Connors completed the escape, the tournament changed. A first-round win had become an event. The old rebel had not arrived as a museum piece. He had arrived as a threat to everyone's sense of order. That is what made the run dangerous. One upset can be dismissed as emotion. 2 wins begin to look like form. 3 wins create a question. By the second week, Connors was no longer just a curiosity. He was the story people wanted to follow. And then came Aaron Krickstein. Their 4th-round match is one of the most replayed and remembered matches in U.S. Open history. It happened on Connors' 39th birthday, which made the drama almost too neat. Krickstein was known as a strong competitor and a player capable of surviving long, difficult matches. He was much younger than Connors, and physically, he should have had the advantage over 5 sets. The match swung wildly. Connors lost the first set, won the second in a tiebreak, lost the third badly, then took the fourth. By the 5th set, the match had become a test of who could hold his nerve inside the noise. And the noise was not neutral. The crowd was with Connors in a way that made the stadium feel less like a tennis venue and more like a living organism. Every Connors gesture drew a response. Every comeback point lifted the sound. Krickstein had to play not just an opponent, but a memory that thousands of people desperately wanted to see continue. This is one of the uncomfortable truths of Connors' career. His relationship with crowds could create magic, but it could also create pressure for the person across the net. Some fans loved that. Some critics saw it as unfair or excessive. Both reactions are part of the Connors experience. He did not ask the crowd to stay quiet emotionally. He asked them, directly or indirectly, to join the fight. Against Krickstein, that connection became the match's defining force. Connors survived the 5th set tiebreak and won. The box score records the result. It does not fully capture the feeling. A 39-year-old had turned a late-night 5-set match into a public argument against time. That win carried him into the quarterfinals, where he beat Paul Harhouse. Again, the details mattered less than the growing disbelief. Connors was now in the semifinals of the U.S. Open, not as a reigning king, not as a protected legend in an exhibition, as an active player in the main draw, still snarling, still swinging, still demanding that younger men finish the job if they wanted him gone. In the semifinal, Jim Courier finally stopped him. Courier was one of the new American powers, a hard-working, heavy-hitting player whose game belonged to the 1990s. Connors' run ended there. No trophy, no fairy tale title, no final victory lap as champion. But the tournament had already given him what it was going to give. It gave him a final roar. The 1991 run is so powerful because it compresses the whole Connors story into a few matches. The defiance, the crowd manipulation, the refusal to behave like a fading star, the physical limits, the emotional excess, the sense that tennis, at its best and worst, is not only about clean winners and proper etiquette. It is about pressure, identity, and the moment when a player convinces thousands of people that the impossible might be delayed for one more point. Connors did not change America American tennis by being universally loved. He changed it by making neutrality difficult. Before Connors, tennis certainly had rebels, personalities, and conflicts. He did not invent intensity. He did not invent the two-handed backhand. He did not invent baseline aggression. History is rarely that simple. But he helped bring those things into a louder, more commercial, more television-ready age. He made a tennis player look less like a guest in a formal room and more like a fighter walking into an arena. That shift mattered for American sports culture. In the United States, fans were used to emotional athletes in boxing, baseball, football, and basketball. Tennis sometimes seemed distant from that world. Connors helped close the gap. He showed that a tennis match could feel like a grudge match even when the players had shaken hands at the net many times before. He made personality part of the product. You can draw a line from Connors to later American tennis stars, though not always a straight one. McEnroe brought his own version of rebellion. Andre Agassi later challenged tennis aesthetics in a different era, with image, clothing, and contradictions of his own. Even players who did not act like Connors inherited a sport where emotion and entertainment had more room. But there is also a cost to that legacy. When a player turns every point into a confrontation, the line between passion and hostility can blur. Connors often lived near that line. His critics had reasons. He could be combative with officials. He could be provocative toward opponents. He could seem to treat sportsmanship as secondary to survival. For viewers who value tennis as discipline under pressure, Connors could be hard to defend. Yet that is why his story still holds curiosity. If he were only a villain, the 1991 U.S. Open would not feel moving. If he were only a hero, the conflict would be too clean. Connors remains fascinating because he was both inspiring and abrasive, brave and theatrical, resilient and difficult. He made people ask what they actually wanted from a champion. Do they want grace? Or do they want fire? Do they want control? Or do they want a player who lets the battle show on his face? Do they want tennis to remain polite? Or do they want it to reveal the raw bargaining that happens inside competition? Connors forced those questions into the open. His game also deserves more careful attention than his personality sometimes allows. The flat hitting, the early contact, and the return pressure were not just signs of aggression. They were technical choices that shaped rallies. Connors could take a server's advantage away by stepping into returns and sending the ball back before the server had fully recovered. He could redirect pace. He could use his backhand down the line to change the emotional direction of a point. His footwork was built around readiness. He was not the biggest athlete on court, but he competed as if balance and anticipation could steal inches from stronger opponents. He also played with unusual durability across surfaces. The U.S. Open changed surfaces during his career, moving from grass to clay to hard court, and Connors won the tournament on all three. That fact is often used to show his adaptability, and rightly so. It also shows how long he remained relevant through a period when the sport itself was being reconfigured. Imagine that challenge. A player builds his game in one tennis world, then keeps competing as the court changes, equipment changes, training changes, and opponents change. Connors did not simply survive a long career. He survived multiple versions of professional tennis. That is why the Rebel label can be too small. Rebellion suggests attitude. Connors had attitude, but he also had craft, discipline, and a staggering appetite for competition. You do not win for that long on noise alone. You do not remain dangerous across generations just by waving your arms at the crowd. The theatrical part worked because there was still tennis underneath it. The mistake is to separate the two too neatly. For Connors, the emotion fed the performance, and the performance justified the emotion. If he screamed and then missed, he looked foolish. If he screamed and then broke serve, the stadium believed. That cycle became his engine. By 1991, the engine should have been dead. That is what made the U.S. Open run feel almost impossible. It was not that Connors suddenly became young again. He did not. He looked like an older player fighting the evidence of his own body. The magic came from watching him solve that problem point by point. He could no longer rely on the same margin, so every surge mattered. Every hold of serve mattered. Every crowd reaction mattered. The matches became less about dominance and more about theft. He stole time. He stole rhythm. He stole belief from younger opponents and handed it to the people in the seats. There is a reason New York embraced that. The city has always had a taste for athletes who compete visibly, not perfectly, visibly. Connors gave the crowd effort it could see from the upper deck. He made struggle legible. You did not need to understand spin rates or tactical patterns to understand what was happening. An old fighter was refusing to leave. But the deeper payoff is not nostalgia. It is the way Connors exposed a truth about sports memory. We often remember champions for their titles, but sometimes we remember them more clearly for the moments when they almost ran out of road. Winning can make greatness official. Resistance can make it unforgettable. Connors' 1991 U.S. Open did not add a ninth major title. It did not restore him to number one. It did not change the record books as much as his prime years did, but it became a kind of final signature. It reminded people that the same qualities that made him difficult also made him extraordinary. The anger, the stubbornness, the suspicion that the world was always about to count him out, the need to turn a tennis court into a personal argument. Those traits could create conflict, and they often did. But in New York, at 39, they created one last masterpiece of refusal. That is the Connors paradox. The tennis establishment wanted order. Connors brought disorder, but he also brought attention. Traditionalists wanted decorum. Connors brought confrontation, but he also brought new audiences into the feeling of the sport. Opponents wanted silence between points. Connors brought a crowd that seemed to breathe with him. He did not make tennis more comfortable. He made it harder to ignore. And in American tennis, that may be his biggest influence. Connors helped prove that a champion could be rough-edged, emotional, and openly combative, yet still command the center of the sport. He widened the acceptable personality of a tennis star, not always in ways everyone liked, not without damage or debate, but undeniably. The left-hander from Illinois did not fit the old room, so he changed the room's temperature. By the time his career faded, tennis had absorbed much of what once made him seem so disruptive. Stadiums expected noise. Television expected personality. Fans expected players to show more than perfect technique. The sport still valued etiquette, but it also understood drama as part of its modern identity. Connors helped push it there. That is why the 1991 U.S. Open remains the right ending to the story, even without a title. It was not a clean coronation. Connors was never a clean coronation kind of player. It was messy, loud, excessive, and stubborn. It had comebacks instead of certainty. It had a crowd that lost its objectivity. It had an older athlete making younger opponents prove again and again that he was finished. Eventually, Courier proved it for that tournament. Time proved it for the career, but not before Connors had bent the event around himself. So the takeaway is not that Jimmy Connors was the greatest player who ever lived, or the easiest champion to admire, or the perfect model of sportsmanship. The takeaway is sharper than that. Jimmy Connors changed American tennis because he made competition feel personal in public. He dragged the private fury of an athlete into the open and dared fans to decide whether they hated it or needed it. And at 39, when the sport thought it knew exactly where to place him, he gave the U.S. Open one last reminder. Some players leave when they decline. Connors made tennis throw him out, point by point. So here is the question. When you remember Jimmy Connors, do you see a champion who crossed the line, or the rebel tennis needed to redraw it?